Yeah, good morning, and welcome to, I guess what I would say may be the most important meeting this whole week. But truly welcome on a Sunday to the V20 meeting. We will at some point have to take a family picture, and there will be a gentleman standing on the ladder. They'll give us a signal much later. Anyway, do you want us to do it now? Okay, great. So if we can all turn towards him.
And smile.
There's another gentleman who's taller than the ladder.
If you count us down, we'll get ready with the smile. Thank you very much. Great. These are some of the major decisions finance ministers need to take in there. It's very difficult times. Really to welcome Kristalina, a real pillar of our organization, and of course Nasheed, who is just a flame bearer, Axel, who we know was really at the helm of the HIPIC initiative. So he's a long proponent of the debt situation in Africa. I'm sure he's going to write it all off before we know it. And then representative from the Secretary General. And then we have Majid, who will also be speaking. He may have the most difficult job to make COP28 count, from promises to execution. Majid, best of luck. You have all of us behind you. We don't have Prime Minister Mia Motley here, but I think we are all working with her and for her as we move towards Dubai, but certainly June in Paris. So fellow V20 ministers and high-level representatives of the V20, representative from the G7 and G20 countries and partner institutions, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the 10th Ministerial Dialogue of Finance Ministers from V20 member states. I recently read and commented on the IPCC synthesis report, which demonstrated how close we are to reaching an irreversible tipping point. Our forests are going up in flames. We're experiencing the continuous rise of sea levels, and more areas are prone to flooding because of the unabated warming of the planet. Economies like ours continue to suffer significant losses in destroyed infrastructure, loss of lives and livelihoods, and growing debt as we struggle to recover what we have lost to extreme climate events. If justice is so important in world affairs, why does it figure so little in the climate crisis? Recently, the UNECA estimated Africa contributes less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Clearly, vulnerable countries are not the cause of the climate crisis. And how do we repair the harm already inflicted? And yet, we also see so few countries in the global north taking responsibility for their actions. The world's top 20 emitters contribute 75% to global emission and have 80 to 85% of the world GDP. And this ought to translate into a moral responsibility that causes G7 and G20 countries to drive the climate course correction and to pay for the socio-economic losses and damages that has been caused as a result of their historical industrial activities. As the world's most systematically climate-threatened economies, one of the main hurdles that vulnerable countries face is access to timely and concessional financing to realize their ambitions. To place this in proper context, climate change costs the African continent some 7 to 15 billion annually, and yet Africa receives just 5% of total climate finance outside the OECD. Clearly, we lack the resources of our wealthy and major economy counterparts. Additionally, our fiscal space is under constant pressure from the impacts of climate change, and the negative effects of climate change are further worsening the already high cost of capital and debt distress facing developing countries today. Economic devastation of this magnitude and financial protecting sinkholes at this scale can only be overcome through a recalibration of the global financial architecture, which must happen not only as soon as possible, but within the current decade. And so today, we are pleased to share this roadmap to cement an international coalition behind a fit-for-climate global financial system called the Accra-Marrakesh Agenda. This started in Accra in March 2019 of our meeting and will be completed during the World Bank IMF annual meetings in Marrakesh, with important stops in Paris to hold the Bridgetown Initiative, and September in November for the Africa Climate Summit, hosted by the Kenyan government and really proposed and supported by Patrick from the GCA. It's time for a new global deal on carbon financing, which is configured to secure win-win carbon financing exchanges that can help us meet global mitigation goals, deliver fair share climate actions, curtail the rising cost of debt, and provide crucial financial support for ambitious climate action that would otherwise not be viable. These are not a call for handouts. It is a call for acknowledging our common humanity and the right to create a much more productive world. What the V20 expects and deserves is economic cooperation on a fair share basis. At the very least, the world owes itself that and owes all of us that, and for a more prosperous future. And so we meet here in Washington, D.C. to advance our call for a fit for climate global financial architecture and development positive climate action. We'll also take the opportunity to establish the CVF V20 as an independent institution focused on ensuring ownership and accountability, ensuring climate prosperity among our member countries. Our goal is to move from V20, we are now 58 countries, to 100 countries by this time next year, and there's going to be a lot of work on that. Excellency, our call for reforms in the global financial architecture is based on realities on the ground and within the realm of systematic actions that can accelerate transformational changes in the real economy towards our common prosperity. With ample liquidity in the global financial system, G-Funds, as we know, has about 400 members or so, with about 130 trillion under management. This is what we need to translate into efficient systems that would support the financing of this initiative with the private sector involved. We need decisive shift of financial flows that will be required towards green and climate resilient investment. This is within our reach with collective action. However, we no longer have a decade. We have just about 6 years and 8 months. Time is truly of essence. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I truly look forward to an interactive dialogue today, and I hope to hear voices raised in solidarity with the Accra-Marrakesh Agenda, with the Bridgetown Initiative in Paris, and with the summit in Africa. But before we get onto the agenda proper, let us hear a video message from our youth representative, Ms. Nikayet Dramani, the CVF Ambassador for Youth. Thank you very much indeed.
We were bequeathed with a beautiful world from the beginning, and it was a great sight to behold, a great sight replete with brooks, greeneries, and great mountains. These were foretold from antiquity. These were bequeathed to us from Titiko Famwa, from Ojemu Jampantrodu, the foliage, flora, and fauna, breathtaking nature meant for our existence, not for our termination. Oh, the trees are now murmuring. The forest is shedding tears. What might be the problem? The problem is the gluttonous nature of the caretaker, humankind. You are humankind, but you are not kind to your planet. The one who was asked to take dominion is chewing his own tongue. Se itwa wanta chemaria na erinem biara. To wit, if you chew your own tongue as a meat, then you have not eaten any meat. The caretaker is meting out injustice to wipe out the forest with rage. As if the caretaker is going to fade away today, forgetting about generations yet unborn tomorrow. Mangroves are being filled with sand and concrete to pave way of habitation of humans. Oh, people of the planet, why are you doing this? For a call to action is now. When will you learn the truth from within that trees will set us free? When will you learn the truth that trees absorb 48% carbon dioxide per year? When will we learn the truth from within that trees absorb dangerous gases every year? And when will we learn the truth from within that trees also serve as carbon skins? Let me avert my mind onto a beautiful painting by a colleague child from the Marshall Islands called Robanti Anien. He said it's a story about climate change. When his island faces climate change effects, plants and vegetations are being ruined. And when the sea level rises, all the homes in his islands are being wiped away. The oceans are crying. Our oceans are crying and roaring with rage. What is wrong with her that is making her so melancholic? Please, she is crying for her babies. She is crying for her belly is being poisoned with plastics. Her babies are all crying. I mean the fishes, the beautiful pearls and the coral reefs are all being destroyed for no fault of theirs. This symbol I'm going to show you now is called the Akobin symbol. It represents a call to action. So please, when I say Ago, respond Amen. Ago! Ago! This is a call to action. Please let us come together as one people. This brings me to another beautiful Edinka symbol called the Aya. It represents resourcefulness and endurance. I, Nakia Germani Sam, unveil to you how our forebears talk about adaptability. The Denchem symbol, it represents adaptability. So, for a livable climate, net zero commitments must be backed by credible actions. Duty bearers, please, I have to tell you, it's not too late. Please pay for the loss and damages, for a call to action is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It just makes you feel very inadequate and worry about the future. She talks about trees will set us free. And Crystalina, that reminds me of a quotation in the Bible which says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." In John, trees will set us free. Great at this juncture, just really, I want to thank you, Nikayat, for that. And it's really my pleasure to invite Crystalina. You were with us from the beginning when you were in the World Bank. Our champion there, will you continue to support us? We really look forward to continue this deliberate collaboration and the way forward. Kristalina, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Very good morning to everyone. Welcome to the IMF. We are very proud to be your physical host, but also to add our skills, resources, and commitment to the objectives of V20. Let me start by saying, as an Orthodox Christian, it is Easter today for me. And celebrating Easter is so uplifting because it is about renewal. It is about hope. And in that sense, I could not think of a better book to be put in front of us. Not too late. Mandela would say, be guided by your hopes, not by your fears. And I want to speak in that spirit. Yes, we do have a crisis. The Minister of Finance of Madagascar said during these meetings, we are at a war, not with each other. We are at a war with the climate crisis. And we have to treat it with that seriousness. And at the same time, our objective is to muster the will, the resources, the capacity to win that war. So how do we see it from the perspective of the IMF? And I would reflect a bit on the discussions we had this week during the spring meetings. First, we recognize that it has been a turbulent time over the last years. We have gone from one shock to another. Climate shocks were ever more present. Those affected by Cyclone Freddy most recently know what it is, but so is Pakistan, so is the Sahel, is California in the United States with the forest fires. We can look around and see that we have to rethink the way we integrate shocks in our economic concepts and bring forward resilience as a fundamental objective to secure growth, prosperity, improvements in the lives of people. We are projecting low growth rates for the next 5 years, 3%. This is in contrast to 3.8% in the last 2 decades. But it's not just the speed of growth, it is also the quality of growth we need to be very concerned about. And when we think about resilience here at the IMF, we recognize that our job is to work with our members for macroeconomic, financial stability, growth, and employment. We cannot achieve this objective if we ignore these factors that undermine stability, and of course, climate is a big part of it. And that our way of defining resilience has to be more comprehensive than it was in our history, when it would be a narrow focus on financial sector, banking sector resilience. Of course, they matter tremendously. Fiscal parameters. We have to think about resilience of people that are educated, healthy, that have a good social protection under their feet. We have to think about the resilience of society, not just the economy, that the social fabric is strong, so when a shock hits, it can withstand better than otherwise. And of course, we need to think about the resilience of our planet. So that concept of resilience is what I believe we can enhance with the tools and language of economics, and you have the commitment, my commitment, this of my staff, that we will continue to work relentlessly in this regard. Secondly, we need resources. What we are seeing, unfortunately, is that fiscal capacity in countries is very limited. Access to capital markets right now for many countries gone. And development finance is struggling to catch up with the needs that are out there. So we translate that in the fund into two big areas of work. One, debt. If precious resources are sucked to serve debt, which has become more expensive to do because of interest rates going up and staying higher for longer, countries would be not well served. Therefore, we take very seriously our obligation as institution to work with the World Bank, to work with the G20 on accelerating that resolution, setting up clear principles. We have one of the big achievements this week is the creation of the global sovereign debt roundtable. Brings traditional public creditors, new creditors, private sector, and the debtor countries. Ken was there, not just for Ghana, but to represent that voice. So we can advance faster and more effectively resolution and prevent that from building up to begin with, which is, of course, where the fund is very engaged on reforms in countries. Second, mobilize finance. Let's face it, concessional finance is critical for countries to deal with the multiplicity of challenges, and concessional finance is not on the scale it has to be. At the fund, we have a concessional instrument called Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. We are calling for, there is a subsidy gap, there is a lending gap. We want to close this gap by the annual meetings in Marrakesh. And this week we made progress. The gap was 1.6 billion at the beginning of the week. It is now 1.2, and we would drive it down. And we almost practically closed the loan resource gap during the week. We also, as you know, we have created an instrument specifically to underpin the structural transformation for resilience to climate shocks and low carbon development, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. During the week, we got some of our members coming forward with more resources for it. We have 40 billion. We are seeing some indication that may go up. 5 countries have already benefited, a 6th one is on the way, 44 countries are in the queue. And it is so important that we all recognize our responsibility to do what is necessary so financing comes on scale. It would make a difference only if it helps move private finance. There is plenty of money. One thing that we are not short of is liquidity in the world. But how do we make it go where it is necessary? And this is really the main preoccupation we have with the RSD and more broadly with our work at the IMF. How we can make conditions for private finance in developing countries, especially in vulnerable countries, such that that move of money actually happens. My conclusion today is to say the following. It is each and every one of us to step forward and support vulnerable countries. We have made vulnerability finally a factor in allocation of concessional finance, and I'm proud we are the first institution to do it. If we all do what we can, and then we do a bit more, then we can make a difference. And we heard this young woman, she said something that I'm sure we will be quoting her on that. Let's remember, we are supposed to be humankind. Can we be kind to each other and kind to our planet? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristalina. With this passion and enthusiasm, we can solve this problem. You did mention that we are at war, and we know how the world tackles war, as we've seen the over $75 billion that Ukraine has been able to get in a few years or in a year. So yes, we are at war, and we should put all our resources together to be able to avert a disaster in future. Now I would like to introduce His Excellency President Mohammed Rashid, founding president of the CVF. We are very proud of, indefatigable flame bearer, and please put on your seatbelts.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, Madam Georgieva from the IMF, Ken from the V20, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I speak to you today with a sense of urgency. I am told to stick to my script. The debt and climate crisis are colliding and producing an unprecedented situation of twin emergencies in the world's most vulnerable countries. Well, as Ken pointed out, I am Mohammed Rashid, the former president of the Maldives. I now work as the Speaker of the Parliament, the People's Majlis. But today, I represent the V20 group of ministers of 58 of the world's most climate vulnerable countries, who collectively are more than 1.5 billion people, including some of the poorest in the world. Before proceeding as a co-founder of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, V20, I want to note two critical things. First, having been part of our enterprise from the very beginning, it is crystal clear we've achieved so much. And while there is still a long way to go, it is clear to me that we are filling the role we set out to play when we founded in 2009, to be a source of solution, to catalyze bold partnerships, and to invest in hope. Because our ambition continues to grow in terms of transforming our economies to realize domestic prosperity and to inject fairness and courage in global politics, today I can say that we are in a crucial moment in the evolution of our common enterprise. It is therefore clear that we must now establish an independent secretariat fully accountable to the V20 and CVF presidency, the Troika and its national members. And I feel we should aim to conclude this process as soon as possible, perhaps in about 6 months. As an independent intergovernmental group representing 58 sovereign nations, we asked the World Bank and the IMF to extend official recognition to the V20 as an official constituency and give the V20's unique experience and enterprise representing the common priorities and interests of 58 of the world's most climate-threatened developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, I have come to this meeting to alert the world to the desperate situation we are in, and to ask for your full attention in addressing these twin emergencies. We can and must fix these emergencies together, because we will not be able to address them successfully if we do so separately. As you will know, Sri Lanka and Ghana have already required attention due to the unsustainability of their debts. But these are the tips of the melting iceberg. We estimate that some 40 V20 countries are in debt distress now, and that the total debt service payment for V20 countries by 2029 will be more than $500 billion. The unfairness of this situation is striking. The CVF's recent traffic light report showed that all the V20's NDCs are 1.5 compliant due to our very low per capita emissions. On the other hand, the NDCs of high-income countries only become 1.5 compliant if we accept entirely a grandfathering approach with unfair shares of the atmosphere. Colleagues, when it comes to historical emissions, vulnerable countries are the creditors and rich, high-emitting nations are the debtors. They should be paying us for mounting cost of loss and damage and adaptation that their emissions are imposing on our livelihoods and economies every single day. Instead, developing countries are telling us that the V20 nations in debt distress owe the creditors $492 billion. Ironically, this debt burden almost exactly parallels the $500 billion in aggregate loss the V20 nations have experienced since 2000 due to climate damages, according to our latest Climate Vulnerable Economic Loss report. So, who owes who what? They cause $500 billion in damage and then tell us that we owe them $500 billion. I know these are not exactly the same things, but surely, the incredible inequality is glaring to any fair-minded person. But I'm not here to argue with you. As always, I am motivated to find positive and progressive ways forward. We can work together because ultimately the twin emergencies of debt and climate affects us all. Together, we must find a way to restructure these debts based on a recognition of unfairness of the current climate situation. The V20 countries to develop and share several recommendations on this, such as the Accra America Agenda. And I put some of these to you, Madam Managing Director, directly in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. But it saddens me greatly that we have seen very little action from the major players. So I repeat today, please, we urgently need large-scale debt service relief with an immediate partial debt suspension for all the debt-distressed V20 nations in order to make the investments our people need this decade. This must bring all the creditors to the table, as the common framework has failed so far to accomplish. This would be encouraged by an approach swapping out all debt with significant haircut for new bonds, partially guaranteed by a new facility which could be hosted at the World Bank, which we propose would cover 80% of principal payments and interest payments for 18 months. We need to replace the case-by-case piecemeal approach suffered by Ghana, Sri Lanka, and many others with a truly common framework in order to avoid a prolonged and a complex process where the debtor governments are disadvantaged and their populations seriously harmed. It is wrong to take a one-size-fits-all approach. Each nation has different circumstances, and this, alongside specific issues of climate-related risks and critical climate spending, will need to be recognized in the debt sustainability analysis for each V20 member in order to make the case to make available climate finance. Looking at restructuring, this must not be contingent on austerity. Doing so will only lead to a deadly cycle of reduced economic output, leading to yet more debt distress for some of the poorest nations in the world. Instead, restructuring must work with climate prosperity objectives of V20 nations to grow their economies and to deliver climate-resilient futures which address climate and debt sustainability in one go. We must also see climate risk fully integrated into debt sustainability analysis as part of any restructuring. And I am encouraged that Kristalina mentioned we have to, I think she did mention exactly this issue on how to include climate risks in DSA analysis, which we feel is not happening right now. The DSAs that the common framework would come out with would not achieve the outcomes that we are seeking. It should be clear to all of us, we can actually use the twin emergencies of debt and climate to address each other in positive, reinforcing upward spiral. Debt restructuring helps to support climate resilience through adaptation and low-carbon transformation in V20 nations as set out in their climate prosperity plans. In a sense, this is a grand-scale debt-climate swap that supports a better outcome and a more realistic chance of reaching the Paris targets for the whole world. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can all agree with me that these are outcomes worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Nasheed. I did tell you the passion and leadership. It's great. Welcome, Bo. Good to have you here. We have indeed had meetings of COP28 presidency, the Open Society, G-Funds, the Rockefeller Foundation, amongst other collaborators. As you know, we also had a meeting on the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. And these all are leading to the collaborations that are important in the efforts to achieve what President Nasheed is talking about and put our issues front and center, which are critical to the survival and climate resilient growth of the V20 membership. We are optimistic that we are beginning to get a common language towards the Accra-Marrakesh agenda, and the necessary momentum is being brought to bear and ensuring that we will get to Marrakesh with the right support from all of you. So thank you for that. Let me now take the opportunity to introduce Axel from the World Bank, a champion that I mentioned led to the success of HIPIC. We hope you can do this again for climate. Congratulations on your promotion to senior managing partner. Axel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ken, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that I would like also to thank you to spell out the Accra-Marrakesh agenda. That's very helpful. What was even more helpful today is to show the video of the youth ambassador, because she touched on something very simple. She asked for credible action. And I think when we have these meetings, we will need to look really at credibility of all our actions, and we need to do a lot more. So I would like to touch in this context on climate change, debt sustainability, and debt, as well as on the evolution roadmap of the bank and what that means. I think that what as an introduction, the V20 is interesting as a group. In that it is not only uniting low-income countries and SIDS, but also quite a set of middle-income countries, be it in East Asia, be it also in Latin America, like in Central America, or Colombia, for example. So I think that's very important that this is not only a low-income problem, but also a middle-income problem, and we need to keep that. And there are different solutions for that. Similarly, I think it is very important that this forum talks about climate change, not only on the mitigated, but particularly on adaptation. And that is really the first call that where everyone is sitting, that we need to keep that balance and put a lot on emphasis on adaptation. I think that is what we are trying to do, certainly in the IDA context, that right now, for example, last year, 60% of our climate finance in IDA countries is dedicated to adaptation. And I think that should be actually an immediate target by everybody to make sure that the adaptation agenda is lifted up. And I think that's quite important. Also, what is important here is that can we do actually more in terms of financing as well as in terms of concessional financing and grants. I think what we have been doing in the V20, basically over the last couple of years, we have steadily increased it. The last 3 years, it was about an amount of $91 billion for the V20. That's up by 55% of the 3 years before that. Climate financing, and particularly grant financing, has actually quintupled over the last 6 years to about $5 billion per year. But what we're also seeing is that while this is going to the IDA countries, the concessional financing, we are challenged, and that is a discussion we need to have, is how do we best support middle-income countries? Because the middle-income countries to get concessional financing is a much harder way to do, and we need to think about it, how we can support these countries as well. Let me turn also to the debt issue. I think that clearly there are, in the IDA context right now, 60% is either debt distressed or in high risk of debt distress. And there are quite a few also middle-income countries that are having problems. Some of this is now being dealt through the common framework. But I think what we need to emphasize is the urgency of action. It is, of course, a completely different landscape compared to the IDA landscape. And therefore, to find easy solutions is more difficult. And I think there we will need all the efforts of everybody. But I think what is most important is when we have the discussions, we need to keep in mind that every minute that these debt restructures are delayed, we are taxing the countries that are affected. They need a reset, and I think there is urgency. And so we need to look at that. So we need debt workouts. Secondly, we need in the future, in particularly related to climate financing, much more longer-term financing. That is easier done in the low-income countries. It is more difficult in the middle-income countries. Again, this is an area where we need to work together. In terms of debt relief, I just want to say that the bank learned from HIPC, it learned from MDRI. We actually introduced ex-ante debt relief on the basis of that sustainability analysis. We provide easier terms when a country is in debt distress, or when we have our traffic line, when a country gets red light, it gets more concessional support, be it including in grants. So we need to keep that in mind. I think this is something also other creditors should think about it. Now, finally, on the evolution roadmap, I think we had actually very good discussions at the Development Committee. I would say the bottom line is we got to first base. I'm not a baseball player, but I understand first base. And Alex is laughing. We wanted the home run, but we maybe get to the home run in Marrakesh. And we will work all together on this. But here is one of the more difficult questions, and that relates to here on climate, but I would also say climate and development, because we should not completely forget the development agenda is in desperate need as well. And that is, what is the ambition for the multilaterals? Personally, I think, given the challenges on the SDGs, given the challenges on climate, given the challenge of fragile, we need to be hugely ambitious and see how we can actually lift that game by all. I'm not talking about the World Bank alone, everybody. And I think that is probably a discussion how we can actually gravitate the world community at the SDG summit, or in Paris in June, or in COP28, that really we do something and then be reminded by this youth ambassador. It is credible action. It is not an announcement. It has to be credible, and then we have to deliver. Thank you.
Axel, thank you very much for that. The passion is clear, the issue of credibility is clear. I think one of the issues, given the plethora of meetings we have had, I guess I'm using your baseball analogy, who is the designated hitter to clear the bases? Or who is a quarterback to throw it through? And I think this is that leadership that we are. Of course, this week we have seen incredible leadership by the women. Yellen, Mia Motley, Kristalina, Amina, the UN, and then of course Ayong Nagayat. So maybe it's Easter and the Mary Magdalene stood up strong, so they may be able to take us over the goal. But we thank you for being with us, and then we'll work with you towards a solution. Would now like to share a video, is that correct, from the UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, Selwyn Hart.
Excellencies, friends, let me start with a sobering assessment of where we are in our fight against the climate crisis. The recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change confirmed that all indicators on climate are heading in the wrong direction. Global emissions are at their highest level in human history, and they continue to rise. Those that have contributed the least to the climate crisis are already paying the highest price. Adaptation limits are being breached. The scale and magnitude of losses and damages are growing exponentially. We cannot afford to cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, not even temporarily. You know better than most what is at stake. There is still a small window of opportunity to act, and we have the tools, we have the roadmap. The benefits of a renewable energy and climate resilient future are well known. So are the cost of fossil fuel addiction and expansion. We need deep emission cuts now. In parallel and with equal urgency, we must act decisively on adaptation, resilience building, and on loss and damage. Unfortunately, we are nowhere close. The global financial architecture is presently not wired to deliver on our climate and development goals. Affordable finance is simply not flowing to the developing world, especially to the most vulnerable. This is why we need the multilateral development banks and other sources of public and low-cost finance to step up and step in to get the money flowing to make the investments affordable and bankable. Major reforms of the international financial architecture and of the MDBs like the World Bank is required. I urge you to use your voice and influence to insist on advancing a meaningful reform agenda this year. These institutions need to overhaul their business models to be more creative and risk-taking. Vulnerable countries are facing multiple crises. They urgently need a financial architecture that delivers highly concessional finance at pace and scale, addresses their debt, stress, and liquidity constraints, and allows them to invest in resilience to climate impacts, and also speeds up their transitions from fossil fuels to renewables. Among other things, we also need the providers of private capital and the credit rating agencies to significantly improve how they perceive and measure risks in the developing world, especially in Africa. Your long-standing concerns on access to finance must be resolved. This is not a moment for tinkering around the edges. Colleagues, I would like to close by acknowledging the tireless leadership of the V20. It is needed more than ever. I encourage you to support the acceleration agenda proposed by the Secretary General, which calls for fast-forwarding action to keep the 1.5 degree goal alive and deliver climate justice for those on the front lines of the climate crisis. The Secretary General and the United Nations stand with you. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and certainly not a time for tinkering around the edges, and the accelerated agenda must be embraced. I do concur that we cannot afford to cross the 1.5 degree threshold, not even temporarily. The climate crisis we are facing today has no boundaries. Failed and delayed promises by high-emitting countries have brought us to this point. But as of the title of the book on your table reminds us, it is not too late. So it's really my distinct pleasure to introduce Majid, who has Sisyphus' burden on his shoulders to deliver beyond promises in COP28. Majid, welcome.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Excellencies, it's a pleasure to be here today. Before I start, I want to extend the greetings of my COP President-designate, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, who is in Sapporo, I believe now, if not on his way to another place, pleading with our G7 friends to work with us to try to address the climate challenge. And he asked me to be here, but wanted to express the commitment and importance of this group. And also our finance minister, who also wanted to express how important this was. And they asked me to extend those greetings from their halves. Your Excellency, Honourable Minister Ken, your leadership this week has been very visible, and we've appreciated our engagements with you, and it's an honour to join you today. I'd like to extend also our sincere appreciation to Her Excellency Kristalina for hosting this very, very important discussion today. As we prepare to host COP28, the UAE is prioritising the need to support those most vulnerable and to leave no one behind. Over the last 2 decades, climate change has eliminated 1/5 of the GDP of the member countries of the V20 group. The COP28 presidency recognizes that vulnerable countries continue to suffer disproportionate impacts, and we are prioritizing both adaptation and climate finance efforts to ensure progress where it's needed. The global stocktake, which will conclude at COP28, is an important opportunity to move the needle on these efforts. COP28 aims to conclude the global goal on adaptation and to operationalize the funding mechanism for loss and damage. And we need to come together to develop solutions that respond to current and future climate change. This includes rapidly scaling up local, regional, and global early warning systems. And I'm pleased to note that the UAE is on the advisory board of the UN Early Warning Systems for All initiative. And we look forward to seeing clear investment plans for the 30 pilot countries that have been selected. Likewise, we look forward to further development of the Global Shield, which constitutes a clear demonstration of collaboration with the insurance sector in minimizing loss and damage. And we want to see more and more initiatives like these growing over time. Colleagues, climate finance remains one of the most significant obstacles to meaningful adaptation support. It is estimated that countries that experience conflict and fragility receive less than $2 per capita of climate finance. We need to increase the overall amount of finance available, as well as facilitate the ability of vulnerable countries to access it. We need to deliver on the $100 billion promised to developing countries, and we need to leverage private sector resources. And we need to ensure that public funding, including loans from the IFIs, are available, affordable, and accessible. It's time to reform international financial institutions to ensure support to climate-stricken countries, many of whom are already in debt distress. This capital is key to leveraging further resources, including that from the private sector, who are often wary of the risk. Ahead of COP28, the UAE President will host a series of workshops to address challenges in dispersing climate finance. We'll be looking at issues around risk tolerance and investment and the goal of unlocking public and private capital. I look forward to hearing your suggestions on how we can make these discussions a success, and I appreciate any guidance on how COP28 presidency can better support vulnerable countries. Mr. Chair, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Majid, and yeah, we do need to work with you on the issue of availability, accessibility, and affordability. And you can see that this week there's been commitment to support of that and the statements that we have already had. So thank you very much indeed. I'd like to, we've already done the group photograph. I'd like to now call on, invite Dr. Hassan Idrisu to present a summary of the senior officials meeting of the V20 that was held on 30th March 2023. Dr. Hassan.
Thank you, Chair. It is my honor to present to you the report of the senior officials meeting of the V20 group that was held virtually on Thursday, 30th March 2023. We convened the V20 focus group meetings and the Joint Technical Committee to discuss a draft of V20 specific initiatives. We started our work at 9 a.m. and adjourned at 1:10 p.m. GMT. We undertook a detailed review of the work program of the V20 group and the planned activities of the different working bodies of the V20. The meeting took note of the significant progress made across the V20 work streams, a report of which we respectfully submit for your consideration alongside other documents prepared by the V20 Secretariat. Chair and Excellencies, all documents were shared with respective delegations ahead of today's ministerial dialogue and are also available in hard copy to delegations in our meeting today. Please allow me to give you a brief account of the documents and key updates before you. First is a summary report of the senior officials meeting, including the reports of the 3 V20 focus groups, advocacy and partnerships, climate accounting and risks, as well as a report of the deliberations of the Joint Technical Committee that considered updates of various V20 initiatives. In the update on public and private resource mobilization efforts for support to the CVF V20 Joint Multi-Donor Fund, follow-up activities include fundraising to support the work program of V20 and expansion of the regional presence of the V20. On the CVF V20 work program for the rest of 2023 until 2024, key elements include major engagements of the V20 group, including meeting to finalize the governance structure and way forward on protection packages of the Global Shield, deepened engagement with equity providers, including Green Climate Fund, and enhanced cooperation with private sector for CPP investment, as well as decisively engaging on a fit-for-climate international financial system. Senior officials also took note of the upcoming key activities of the V20, including climate prosperity plans, and within that, G7 V20 Global Shield against climate risks, as well as broader international reform. The senior officials meeting also reviewed the agenda and the discussion items of the meeting of the high-level consultative group of the INSU Resilience Global Partnership on Thursday, the 25th of May, in the margins of Africa Development Bank annual meetings in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, as well as the finalization of the governance structure of the G7 V20-led Global Shield against climate risks. On climate finance, having deliberated on the current and looping shortfalls, and having advocated for the $500 billion USD delivery plan alongside an implementation plan for how climate adaptation finance can reach an equal footing with mitigation finance, there were discussions on the need for COP27 to mandate a report by the Standing Committee of Finance to report on adaptation finance flows. This will enable all parties to ascertain progress on COP26 decision for developed countries to ensure at least a doubling of adaptation finance by 2025. On carbon financing program of the V20, we discussed the need to create ways to fund climate prosperity plan projects with carbon finance, and so we will work together on a platform in exchange for returns and on investment and internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOS, which can be credited to relevant investments. We likewise discussed implementation and further development of the Global Shield against climate risks, including capitalization efforts. Chair, on the Joint Technical Committee, senior officials deliberated on the climate prosperity plans, current and planned activities. We also received an update on CPP Fellowship Program to drive more South-South collaboration and coordination. On the accelerated financing mechanism, of note is the need for AFM design finalization and to secure guarantee capital in trust funds of the multilateral development banks that can be utilized for the AFM. Regarding the task force on climate development and the IMF, we are glad to see that so far the IMF has begun reflecting our own thinking on the macro criticality of climate. Our task force has put together a report on the role of the IMF in multilateral surveillance activities, including strengthening bilateral surveillance and the scaling and reform of IMF's lending toolkit. We look forward to work hand in hand with the IMF, including through becoming an official constituency group. The program of work on the sustainable insurance facility of the V20 included elements to support and rapidly scale up last mile capacity in demand aggregators such as supply chains, government agencies, and other institutions, and to prepare capital markets to accept climate risks for the last mile infrastructure to ensure that demand is aggregated, resulting in the efficient pricing of risks, and to ensure that climate vulnerable populations assess effective risk transfer. On the V20 Loss and Damage Funding Program, we are grateful for contributions from the Open Society Foundation and the government of Wallonia. We are also working to unlock adaptation funds through the Global Environment Facility. Moreover, we continue to work on derivative analytics on protection gaps and displacement following the launch of the third edition of Climate Vulnerability Monitor and the commission of work on the second edition of the Low Carbon Monitor. Mr. Chair, through the years, the V20 senior officials have been meeting and deliberating on issues regarding the international financial architecture. And finally, we have the draft of the Accra-Marrakesh that launches today as a roadmap to be finalized at the next ministerial meeting in October. We deliberated on a draft decision and elements for communique as proposed outcomes of today's ministerial dialogue. The final text of the communique has been prepared on the basis of elements discussed by the senior officials and further discussions through this week. The senior officials will reconvene in October 2023 in the lead up to the 11th V20 Ministerial Dialogue. We'll continue to finalize the Accra-Marrakesh agenda with partners and collaborate actively through the year towards the advancement of the V20 agenda and work program. Mr. Chair, we acknowledge the governments of Bangladesh, Marshall Islands, Ethiopia, and the Philippines as previous chairs that have contributed to the continued work program to date and supported a number of landmark V20 initiatives. We also express our appreciation to the V20 Focus Group co-chairs for their leadership and to our partners and observers for their commitment and support. I thank you for the attention and submit our meeting report and all related documents for your consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. And here, Axel, I guess the issue of adaptation comes up strong, and therefore, for most of us, the issue of IDA that you mentioned also come up strong. We know that you front-loaded some 37 billion this year, which means lower amounts for more critical years coming forward. And you have had, I'm sure, an earful about tripling either because of its criticality in the years ahead. So thank you indeed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our first roundtable will focus on the G7 V20 led global shield against climate risk and on debt sustainability. Rising debt and cost of capital are not simply the result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but rather an out-of-date and out-of-tune global financial architecture that does not address the multiplicity and complexity of risks can also result in debt accumulation. Over time, V20 countries have had to borrow funds to cope with climate-related and other shocks. As climate science anticipates, climatic events will only intensify and become more frequent in the future, and where insufficient adaptation responses exist, as in the case in V20 states, climate fuel risks intensify loss and damages. Financial protection, therefore, is fast emerging as a major macroeconomic concern for climate-vulnerable economies. As a response in 2022, the G7 and V20 launched the Global Shield Against Climate Risks with the aim of reducing the financial protection gap through prearranged and trigger-based funds. In this regard, Germany took a leadership role in Sharm el-Sheikh, 170 million euros. Other countries in the EU, France, Ireland, and Denmark also complemented that. It's really my pleasure to have Jürgen Sattler, Director General for International Development Policy in the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany, take over this session. Jürgen, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Minister, for setting the tone for this important discussion, which is on the Global Shield and debt sustainability. And the Global Shield is certainly a very important contribution, but it's only a part of the solution, that's clear. So we have to reform the whole system, the whole architecture, and to better include resilience in all what we are doing. And therefore, it's so important that we progressed with regard to the World Bank evolution agenda, because this is very much about bringing resilience into everything the World Bank is doing. And there we are looking forward to the annual meetings in order to close that first step and to take really the big decisions. So back to the Global Shield. It's an important contribution to the new architecture, and you can be sure that my country, Germany, firmly stands behind the ambition we set with the Global Shield, and it's about protection of vulnerable people and vulnerable countries. So we stand ready to continue our strong partnership to work towards closing the huge financial protection gap that exists in V20 countries and beyond. I would like to thank at that moment and to congratulate the Vulnerable 20 group of Ministers of Finance for your leadership in continuously raising ambition, most recently with the Accra Marrakesh agenda. This year is certainly a key moment to revolutionize risk management for our climate insecure world economy, and we must double down efforts to address the new climate resilience reality. And we must double down efforts in the war, as Kristalina said, in the war against climate change. So we are looking forward to working together in these areas throughout the whole year, and finally to make the Global Shield a success. We will start implementation of the first protection packages. So we are talking about Ghana and Pakistan, and other countries will follow. And I would like to clarify that the Global Shield is really about many instruments. It's a comprehensive approach which looks at the micro level with micro insurances. It's about macro level, for example, the contingent debt clauses. It's about strengthening social safety nets. That's also very, very important in my view. And it's all about pre-arranged financing. And we need more money. And I would like to ask, colleagues that are sitting around the table, if you want to save money, put your money into that, because it's much more it's cheaper than if you have to mobilize the money afterwards once the crisis hits. So with that, let me invite the first speaker who will join us per video link. And this is His Excellency Biman Prasad, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Strategic Planning, National Development and Statistics of Fiji.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Bula Vinaka and good morning. It gives me great pleasure to address this ministerial dialogue of finance ministers. It is rather unfortunate that I am not there physically, as I have had to return to capital for an important economic summit. As fiscal managers, we know all too well the risk climate change poses to our national economies and on the lives of our people and livelihoods. Without careful management, it is likely that the impacts of climate-induced disasters will be felt most strongly by the poorest, most marginalized, and most remote communities, reinforcing existing vulnerabilities that exist in our economies. Fiji is on the front lines of climate change, having experienced back-to-back tropical cyclones, flooding, slow onset events like sea level rise. As an island nation, we are a negligible contributor of the climate warming greenhouse gases, but possesses one of the finest sets of climate change policies on mitigation, adaptation, climate change mobility, including on finance for climate action. We also have a Climate Change Act that has been ratified by Parliament that gives effect to the various climate policies. The reality, however, is that these policy aspirations get derailed when we are battered by storm after storm, undergo a fiscal squeeze, and start piling debt, as we did after the Category 5 cyclone in 2016. We lack the fiscal space to adequately respond to disasters, and for this reason, we welcome the G7 V20-led Global Shield that aims to deploy anticipatory finance in the form of trigger-based and pre-arranged finance. This is a need in the Pacific region, and we are glad that the Pacific is a pathfinder region under the Global Initiative. We need more resources under the Global Shield to scale up anticipatory finance initiatives. We stand ready to deepen our collaboration with stakeholders to craft solutions to sustain protection, one that will increase protection for poor and vulnerable people by substantially enhancing pre-arranged finance, insurance, and social protection mechanisms against disasters and slow onset events. Frequent and more intense disasters will no doubt lead us into a situation of debt stress. While we are ready to explore options such as debt to climate swaps, we cannot ignore the fact that climate change adaptation is an absolute must to build resilience of our economic systems. Finance, especially grant-based resources that can be readily accessed by island and atoll states of the Pacific, will propel us forward in the climate fight. And I want to appeal to the countries of the global north to double their commitment of finance for adaptation sooner rather than later. Finally, we recognize the importance of a global financial architecture that delivers for the poor and lend our full support to the Accra Marrakesh agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite His Excellency Nogoe Acostayan, Minister of Finance, Costa Rica. Over to you.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much. For Costa Rica, this is a very important forum because we represent a middle-income country. And vulnerability is something that is cross-cutting in the world. Almost all of us face situations that were not viable just a short time ago. Climate change has represented a situation that we as a country, that multilateral development organizations really had no clarity in how we were going to deal with the situation. Now, Costa Rica has invested a lot in developing its human capital, and we insist on climate change and how it affects infrastructure, but we haven't looked all that much at the human impact. So we need instruments. In the specific case of climate change, and in those cases where what we have is an extreme climate event, their insurance is tremendously important. And I think that that speaks well of this initiative and the need to involve many more resources in this type of activity. But human capital is at risk, and the human capital at risk can only be defended with fiscal space. Almost all countries following the pandemic, following the inflationary crisis, almost all countries are facing a situation where we have very little fiscal space. So we need tools that will allow us to increase that fiscal space, because human capital can only be acquired by sustainable investment in health and education. And here, climate change has an important effect. Food security is requiring more and more investment, and investing in better technology. Education has to be more and more in keeping with the developments in today's world. And in that connection, I think that for Costa Rica, it's tremendously important to have access to those resources. But equally important is that those countries that have been able to move ahead in environmental sustainability have some sort of benefit for having taken part in this effort. Costa Rica, over many years, has been moving ahead in environmental sustainability. We have invested in reforestation. We have invested in making good use of our natural resources. Our electric grid is 99% based on renewable resources. And I think that that is absolutely essential to be able to come in and structure products that are in keeping with this sustainability. And from the standpoint of the country, it's absolutely essential that we have initiatives that clearly establish the necessary instruments to deal with specific problems. I feel that it's absolutely essential that at this juncture, multilateral organizations that provide resources think about the need of looking at sustainability, seeing it as a priority as investment decisions are made in different countries. Thank you.
His Excellency Benjamin Diokno, Secretary of Finance of the Philippines. Over to you.
Distinguished colleagues, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, good day. In the recent Asia-Pacific Regional Public Debt Management Forum, conducted by the Asian Development Bank, our national debt managers came together to discuss the current challenges in the region. This includes recent trends and issues such as increased uncertainty in the global financial markets, higher debt levels in member countries, heightened geopolitical risk, global monetary tightening, and persistent inflation due to supply chain disruptions, causing a surge in prices. We must strike a balance between achieving sustainable and resilient economic development and addressing the intensifying climate crisis, which has compounded the complexities of managing public debt and market policies. Financing climate action should not be seen as a competing priority. Rather, it should be treated as an indispensable part of economic growth and development. Developing and climate vulnerable countries bear witness to the indispensable role of finance and the international finance system in climate action. Climate change adaptation is an urgent priority for the Philippines. For this, we rally to pursue concrete actions in addressing, minimizing, and averting loss and damage, specifically loss and damages experienced due to climate change. The Philippines recognizes the importance of transparency, accessibility, predictability, and efficiency in climate finance to deliver concrete projects, programs, and initiatives. We must reinvent and revolutionize the way we produce, distribute, and consume as a society. While we understand the essence of implementing prudent debt management policies and operations, local communities on the ground face the adverse effects of intensifying climate risk and hazards. When disasters strikes, it is the poor that suffer the most. We need to work on merging existing financial mechanisms with the scientific evidence of climate change. In a nutshell, the amount of climate finance towards climate change mitigation and adaptation actions should correspond to the needs of developing and climate vulnerable countries. These needs should reflect both the economic and non-economic losses and damages from climate change and incorporate much needed investments for the expected increase in climate and disaster risk. Governments and regulators should continue to have an increasing role in providing a conducive environment for the private sector and the general public to collaborate and expand climate initiatives. This collaboration will bolster our climate agenda and advance a financial architecture that is truly fit for climate and development positive. The rising market interest in environment, social, and governance, or ESG investing, should be sustained and encouraged by regulators to promote a whole-of-society approach towards climate action. Together, we must raise our collective ambitions and respond to the climate crisis with urgency, speed, and scale. The Philippines eagerly awaits the concrete collective actions born out of these discussions. Thank you.
Thanks to you. And I would now like to hand over to His Excellency Gonzalo Hernandez, Vice Minister of Finance and Public Credit, Colombia. But looking at you, I think you do not really look like Gonzalo, but please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, unfortunately, he just left. He had a flight to catch, but we really want to share our view from Colombia as a middle-income country here in this very important group. So, as many of you know, Colombia is the second most biodiverse country in the world, but we are also, as a tropical country, highly affected by climate-related hazards. Disaster risk is Colombia's largest contingent liability, representing 4% of our GDP. Almost 90% of Colombians are exposed to 2 or more natural hazards. Consequently, Colombia, as many other middle-income countries, faces a twofold challenge: to create adaptation measures to protect our people and their livelihood, and to drive economic growth while mitigating its impact on climate change. In this regard, Colombia has taken important steps. We have developed a local green bond market and a green taxonomy, as well as strengthened resilience with instruments such as the CAT-DDO. However, facing climate change is an enormous global challenge no single country can face alone. Therefore, we call for an active role of the international financial institutions. The global financial architecture should be transformed to internalize the externalities associated with the social cost of climate change. For that, we need a coordinated global answers where the World Bank and the IMF should be leading the path. New financial instruments should be created and mainstreamed. Unfortunately, no matter how creative we become in terms of developing these new financial instruments, there are not enough resources available on the table. Additional resources and from new additional sources are urgently needed to support developing countries. On this process, the World Bank Group and the IMF have a catalytic role on the provision of adequate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building for our countries. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks to you. And the next on my list is Her Excellency Miriam Manarat Moner, Deputy Minister of Finance, Maldives. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. As a founding member of the V20, the Maldives is proud to remain on the front lines in the battle against climate change. Despite contributing less than 0.01% of global carbon emissions, the government of Maldives increased spending on climate change adaptation and mitigation by 3,210% since 2011 to 2022, spending a total of $587 million during $7 million during this period. This demonstrates not only a strong commitment towards taking climate action and fulfilling our nationally determined contributions towards our net zero target by 2030, but also the rapid rise in our spending requirements due to the effects of climate change. As a small island developing state, our national budgetary resources are simply not enough to meet these growing climate demands. It is evident that climate-related risks factor heavily into long-term fiscal sustainability. Not only are spending needs for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage increasing exponentially each year, but the negative effect of climate change on vital sources of revenue and growth for vulnerable countries cannot be understated. For example, the rise in sea levels, increase in extreme weather events, and the loss of natural attractions and biodiversity can impact the tourism industry, which is a significant source of revenue and employment in many countries, including the Maldives. With the world still reeling from the socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, with elevated levels of debt distress and tightened fiscal space worldwide, it is critical that global resources are allocated towards sustainable and economically transformative solutions. Failure to act now will have significant and irreversible economic and social costs to us all and threatens to reverse the hard-earned progress that has been made towards achieving sustainable development goals. It is clear to us that climate vulnerability has still not been accurately factored into the resource allocation policies of MDBs and other major lenders. We must develop standardized climate risk assessment tools and methodologies that are in harmony with the views of the vulnerable countries that are most directly affected by climate change. We welcome the Global Shield initiative by the V20 to provide the much-needed financial protection against climate risk for vulnerable countries. Additionally, through the use of innovative and cost-efficient solutions to incentivize and unlock private sector capital with credit guarantees, enhancement, and other de-risking measures, we can also encourage greater participation of domestic private financial markets. To conclude, as President Nasheed said, we must invest in hope. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Minister. I would now like to invite His Excellency Abdoulaye Diallo, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs from the Gambia.
Thank you, Zetla. Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, the Gambia is already experiencing severe impacts of climate change, while being the least responsible for it. Changing rainfall patterns have increased drought and flood risk for our country. For our country's rain-fed agriculture, resulting in lower yields or crop failure. Last year, the Gambia experienced widespread flooding, affecting an estimated 17,201 people from 1,961 households. Climate change-induced sea level rise and coastal erosion are equally concerning. As a low-lying country, a meter rise in sea level could potentially inundate over 8% of the country's land area, including 20% of our current lowland rice-growing areas. To ensure food security and protect livelihoods, the government has implemented measures to reduce and manage these impacts. Example is the insuring against drought. Yet due to fiscal pressures and growing debt burdens as a result of the pandemic and accelerated climate-fueled risk, the cost of capital, financing insurance premiums, and building market opportunities for protection measures proves increasingly difficult. As climate-fueled risk intensify, losses and damages due to insufficient adaptation responses are weighing heavily on all climate-vulnerable countries' budgets. The major shortfall of financial protection to respond to these stacking losses is further contributing to debt instability. The V20, together with the G7, have co-developed the Global Shield Against Climate Risk with the hope to harness a sea change in pre-arranged and trigger-based financial protection against climate risk capable of ultimately closing the protection gap. As you might be aware, we are co-chairing the Insurer Resilience Global Partnership, through which the concept of Global Shield was developed and was consolidated with a broad set of stakeholders and launched at the COP27. In the midst of this climate chaos, we must turn to economic cooperation and development partners through the V20 Accra Marrakesh agenda in support of our development aspirations to improve the country's living standards and the well-being of our citizens. The Global Shield is a strong example of that, and we look forward to its implementation in the Gambia. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list is His Excellency Gerard M. Sakios, Ambassador of the Marshall Islands to the United States. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Chair. Before I begin my remarks today, let me thank Ms. Nakiyat Tramani, Climate Vulnerable Forum Youth Ambassador, for her eloquent remarks and powerful reminder to all of us. I have the honor to address this important gathering amongst custodians of public finance and to discuss the financial and fiscal challenges of addressing existential climate threats. As an atoll nation on the front lines of climate change, we are acutely aware of the climate risks we are facing, and it would take for us to secure a safe future for our economy, country, economy, and the lives and livelihoods of our people. There is no doubt there is a major gap in financial protection. Our own experience of working on financial protection solutions has taught us this one valuable lesson. To be effective, realities on the ground must be taken into account, including but not limited to the unique development, geographical, and scientific context in each region and country. This is how we can make financial protection work for the vulnerable, and we look forward to the implementation of the Global Shield. We need a whole raft of climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions in the Pacific that are accessible and meet the range of needs that exist, from the smallest of islands, such as the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and other atoll nations, to the larger islands of the Pacific. Timely access to funds should allow the most direct and immediate assistance to be received on the ground to even the most remote islands and communities, and request the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company to be provided with the full premium subsidy of $9 million in a single tranche to serve our needs comprehensively. Excellencies, we are not victims, but a resilient people. Even though we are on the front lines of this crisis, our rights for development and progress are paramount. Helping the most vulnerable meet our sustainable development aspirations, including through climate prosperity plans, require the full finance backing of the G7 and G20 and that of the private sector, which can achieve economies of scale through project bundling opportunities across Pacific states where appropriate. Climate finance remains a top development agenda item for us in the region. Our call for grant and concessional finance and readily accessible finance has never been greater. The delivery of the $100 billion per year promised in 2009 and the doubling of adaptation finance is a necessity. But we also realize that a financial architecture is attuned to the development aspirations of climate-vulnerable countries is also a vehicle for delivering climate finance required, including the allocation of greater resources for climate adaptation. In this regard, we welcome Accra Marrakech agenda and hope that by the time of its landing in Marrakech, during our next ministerial dialogue, we would have mapped out the key reforms required in the international finance architecture. We need to shift the dial on implementing fundamental reforms sooner rather than later. As previous chair of the CVF and the V20 and a current member of the Troika, the Marshall Islands made a financial contribution to the CVF V20 Joint Multi-Donor Fund to support the work of the CVF and the V20 group. Chair, we have witnessed how our financial contributions has benefited and continues to render benefits for V20-led initiatives by leveraging additional funds. We are not done yet. The climate fight we have started through the CVF and V20 platform is only beginning to unfold. And for that reason, we call for the establishment of an independent, standalone secretariat for the CVF V20 that is fully accountable to the presidency, the Troika, and its membership. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll now hear a video message by my minister, Her Excellency Svenja Schulze, Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Germany. She's sending her regards and regrets very much that she cannot participate here in person.
Excellencies, colleagues, the partnership with the V20 is of special importance to me. The V20 and the G7 under the German presidency launched the Global Shield against climate risk last year. In doing so, we demonstrated something key, that those countries that have produced the most emissions in the past are working now closely together with those countries that climate change has rendered particularly vulnerable. And they are doing so in the politically challenging area of loss and damage caused by climate change. This sends a visible and important signal. The Shield provides a systematic, coherent, and sustained approach for closing protection gaps and for safeguarding people financially against the impact of climate shocks. This makes it an important element in loss and damage funding arrangements. Let us strive to achieve the high ambition of the Shield by convincing more donors to make substantial contributions, by tapping into innovative funding sources, by making use of the extensive toolbox that institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund can provide, and by continuing as the V20 to demonstrate strong leadership on a global and a national level and in the Shield's Pathfinder countries. Let us work together to find a path towards a climate-neutral and resilient future.
Thank you. And I would like to hand over now to Mark Mallow-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to Ken and Majid and all those who have worked so hard to make the V20 what it is today, an extraordinary voice and force on these issues. And we in the foundations, and I speak not just for OSF, but I think for my colleagues at SIF and Rockefeller, are very proud to play the role of providers of seed capital to so many of the initiatives which have developed recently, not just the V20 and the roadmap, Accra to Marrakesh, but the Bridgetown Initiative, which we all also strongly support, as well as work on the MDB Accelerator to press for further reform at these institutions, along with debt advisory and civil society advocacy initiatives that we support. And proudly also at the beginnings of the Loss and Damage Fund, the first pilot version of it at Glasgow, where SIF and ourselves, along with the Government of Scotland, were the first funders. And it is in that spirit of being seed funders and early providers of support to initiatives like this that I would urge the V20 to spread its wings as soon as possible and escape the very generous founding net of the GCA, but to stand on its own. I think this is, if I may say so, critically important to gather as wide a range of donors to your efforts as possible. Thank you.
Thanks to you. And I would now like to invite Aloto Palo, CEO from the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Honourable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be invited to the 10th V20 Ministerial meeting and to deliver this intervention as the Chief Executive Officer of the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company, or PCRIC for short. PCRIC was established in 2016 to provide innovative financial products and services to support Pacific Island countries respond to disasters quicker and more effectively. As CEO of PCRIC, it is my honor and privilege to participate in these discussions on our future in the face of ever-increasing risk and on how we can use pre-arranged financing to be resilient to disasters with a more proactive approach to disaster risk management. While we have made great progress over the past 7 years, the risk of disaster is growing and our member countries are more physically constrained than ever before. We continue to make investments to ensure our products can build the resilience of the Pacific region, but it's clear that our member countries need premium subsidies to ensure the coverage we offer is comprehensive and can make a real difference when disasters strike. Indeed, in her opening remarks on scaling up resilient and sustainability financing on Monday, Dr. Georgieva emphasized the need for subsidized financial instruments to tackle climate and disaster risk. And if this is not provided, then the key multilateral institutions represented in this room would be failing their member countries. I thank Dr. Georgieva for her leadership in recognizing what is desperately needed for these tiny nations in the Pacific Blue Continent that are facing an existential crisis from the impact of climate change. In response to the challenges our countries face, in 2021, PMZ provided 9 million euros specifically for premium subsidies for Pacific Island countries to access policies from PICRIC. Following the interventions of the Financial Secretary, Patrick Rakeni of the Marshall Islands, during the last ministerial meeting, these funds currently held in the Global Risk Financing Facility are due to be transferred to PICRIC in the coming months via the Global Shield window of the V20 Joint Multi-Donor Fund. We are already working with these organizations in this room to this process, but we encourage our partners to ensure the full 9 million euro is received by PICRIC in the coming months. So our member countries are protected for multiple years. It will also mean we can expand our reach across the Pacific to cover additional members. Mr. Chair, I wish to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge the critical role of the World Bank in having the visions to drive efforts towards building financial resilience in the Pacific region. It was through these efforts that PICRIC was created, and not to forget our donors for their continued support. Mr. Chairman, let me conclude by saying that PICRIC, on behalf of the Pacific region, is looking forward to working in partnership with the G7, the V20, the World Bank, and other development partners to ensure this much-needed support reaches our tiny island states over the coming months, and to support the realizations of the G7, V20 Global Shield, and closing of the disaster protection cap in the coming years. I thank you for your attention.
Thanks to you, and we'll now hear a video message from Mrs. Ekosui, Secretary General from the Insurance Development Forum.
Excellencies, distinguished representatives, thank you for the opportunity to speak during the high-level V20 ministerial meeting aimed at advancing a fit-for-climate architecture and development positive climate action. Excellencies, I think that we're all aware that climate and disaster risk understanding is an indispensable foundation for sovereign risk strategies that include resilient investment, transfer of residual risk to markets, and disaster response programs that protect our citizens. Global forums have formally recognized that we must all get ahead of risks instead of being surprised after the event. Over decades, the insurance sector has developed risk insights and risk management as a strategic skill. Through a combination of financial technology, science partnerships, and global experience, this expertise has created a capability that applies well beyond traditional indemnity insurance. The models and data generated will never be perfect, but they are extremely useful in reducing uncertainty and building the confidence that is so essential for mainstreaming climate risk finance. The Insurance Development Forum, which is a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry and co-chaired with international organizations, has as its central mandate the objective to optimize and extend the use of insurance and related risk management capabilities to build greater resilience and protection for people, communities, businesses, and public institutions that are vulnerable to disasters and their associated economic shocks. That is why we are so pleased with the partnership that we've been able to develop with the V20 in line with this agenda, and specifically in launching the Global Risk Modeling Alliance with the support of the government of Germany. The Global Risk Modeling Alliance is an expression of true collaboration, and where the principles of risk modeling as a public good is seen as a first step in unlocking finance for investment in resilience and reduction of the protection gap. Similarly, local ownership of the risk analysis is central to the effort of the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, as it generates greater trust and confidence in the decisions that are made as a result. I am therefore...
hard landing. But I think we got the message, and I will now move on to the last speaker on my list, who is Dr. Hanan Morsi, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa.
Thank you. Let me start by asserting that United Nations Economic Commission for Africa stands ready to support and partner with the V20 to make that work for climate. I would like here to focus on 3 areas that I believe are important in that regard. The first has to do with debt resolution. And here we need to make sure that the G20 common framework, there is an overhaul of that framework to make it effective, transparent, time-bound, and to provide standstill of this service upon application, as well as expand its eligibility to include middle-income countries. The second point relates to the need to enable countries to have access to financing that is needed for investments in climate action. And to do that, there is a need to ensure improved terms of lending to be available, including lower cost of borrowing, longer maturities, as well as allowing state contingent repayments. And in that area, I believe that it's critical to ensure availability of concessional financing, including, of course, from the IMF and the World Bank. What is really key is to ensure that the funding pledges for the poverty reduction facility and the remaining amounts for the subsidy account, that these funding gaps are closed, as well as to ensure additional resources for IDA in order to avoid a cliff in terms of its financing capacity going forward by $10 billion and to even expand the concessional financing capacity of the World Bank. And as ECA, we stand ready to advocate on these important asks alongside of the V20 in the coming months. Third has to do with really focusing on innovative finance to support these issues. And here it's important to really unlock resources for climate action. This includes credit enhancement instruments, guarantee facilities, as well as debt for climate swaps that would allow countries to reduce their cost of debt servicing and create fiscal space to invest in climate resilience. And we would also be happy to work with the V20 to support countries that are interested in undertaking such swaps. Finally, I would like to highlight that we need to have 2023 as a year of action. There are many good ideas and solutions that exist, but what we need to see is a move to implementation. And during the various important global forums that will happen this year, we need to collectively push and advocate for change to build a sustainable and prosperous future for V20 members and the world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And this brings us to the end of this session, of this roundtable. It was very inspiring to hear your views, your thoughts, your vision on both financial protection and debt sustainability. And I think we can be sure these are two issues which will keep us awake the nights ahead. You can be assured that Germany remains a strong partner of the V20, and we also stand ready to support your aspirations to be a stand-alone institution. We also recognize the Accra Marrakesh agenda to put forward by the V20 and look forward to exchanging further on the goal of the agenda. So thanks a lot for your partnership, for the discussion, and over to you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. I think you summarized the issues very well. We are behind about half an hour, so we're going to need your endurance, and we're going to depend on the leadership and strength of Patrick to get us through, because the next roundtable is really critical with regards to the resources needed to get into the future. I want to continue to thank Patrick for keeping the flame burning, keeping V20 and CVF under his tutelage. And over to you, Patrick.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Ken. First of all, I'm happy to take the blame indeed that we will run a little bit late today. Secondly, I want to congratulate you, particularly Honourable Minister, and you, President Nasheed, of transforming the CVF and the V20 from originally a vulnerability agenda to a resilience agenda, and now to a prosperity agenda. So I think it's also very logical that there will be an institutional support system which supports that journey. Because I think it's fair to say, I mean, most of you, or some of you, are in that room, and I think you, Ethel, you were there, in October 2014 during the annual meetings of the World Bank, IMF, when the V20 was launched. And remember, at that annual meeting in October 2014 in Lima, the V20 drew a red line and said, well, 1.5 degree, nothing less than that, or nothing more than that, 1.5. A couple of years later, just before Glasgow, also at the annual meetings, the V20 drew another red flag, doubling adaptation finance. That has to be delivered. And we saw the power of the voice of the V20 just before Sharm el-Sheikh on the loss and damage agenda. So I think it's extremely important to recognize the impact of the V20 since its inception in 2014. I think, Jürgen, at that time, you may have been ED at the World Bank supporting this agenda. But I think what Axel said today is very important. At the end of the day, it is the credibility of action which is the only litmus test of all of us around the table. And I think what we've heard today is sort of a celebration, I think Kristalina mentioned it, of the hope agenda. We see progress. The Global Shield is a very sort of logical example of that, the RST of IMF. I think the extraordinary financing of the World Bank and what you plan to do forward is I think, extremely critical. The largest adaptation program in Africa is the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. $25 billion over 5 years has been put on the table. But the credibility of action, quite frankly, can only really be tested by and answered by the members of the V20 themselves. So what better way to start this second roundtable with what Kristalina mentioned, a country truly recognized as ground zero of the climate emergency. And Madam Minister from Madagascar, yesterday we met, and you said, well, we are a country with a debt crisis, a fiscal crisis, an access to climate finance crisis, I wrote down, a food crisis, and we're negotiating with the IMF, we negotiated with the World Bank. So this roundtable is about solutions. What do you need? And what do you bring to the table? Madam Minister.
Thank you, Patrick. Honorable Minister of Finance and Economic Planning of Ghana, Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, more than ever, vulnerable developing countries need to have a common stance to address climate change issues. Those issues push our macro-financial situation at risks and can undermine our development policy, our debt sustainability, and our fiscal space. As for Madagascar, which is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, we are frequently hit by tropical cyclones, floods, and intense drought in some regions, mainly in the south of Madagascar. Over the last 30 years, we registered more than 70 climate disasters, and 6 of which are severe droughts, causing severe famine and death. The impact of climate disaster cost more than 4.8% of our GDP in a year. For example, the impact of the 5 successive cyclones in 2022 is estimated $1,800 million. But we cannot afford to find enough financial means to rebuild the consequences of such a disaster. Madagascar is more than ready to join the Climate Vulnerable Forum and the Vulnerable 20 Countries Plan by taking actions toward economic transformation and climate prosperity. We are willing to initiate, with all of you, a climate prosperity plan process. At the national level, our government has already initiated the Emergence Plan of Madagascar as the national strategic plan to set up an inclusive and sustainable development. Madagascar has also adopted a national plan for adaptation and a national determined contribution. And the estimated amount of this plan is around $21 billion, but the current amount we can afford is around $300 million a year, all partners included. Multilateral financing systems are willing to give $16 billion and $21 billion to Ukraine because they are at war. But let us know that we are also at war with the climate disaster. So why don't we deserve the same treatment? We have to remember that those climate disasters are the consequences of rich countries' actions, but low-income countries like Madagascar are the victims. We think that the allocation of such a climate fund should not even have prior actions because the simple fact that the country has been damaged is already the main condition to benefit from any climate fund. It is unfair to ask for reforms or prior action for climate change because we are here victims. We need to set up a climate justice. This is why Madagascar requests the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund of the IMF and the Regional Climate Risk Fund from the World Bank. We think that more than anyone else, we deserve such a fund without any other prior action than the damages we are facing. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleague ministers, the uncertainty and complexity of the current global system call for agile responses and for resilience to climate risk. Let us stick together for a better work. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much indeed, Madam Minister, for your bold statement. Knowing that we are behind time, I would suggest that we breach a protocol a little bit in the sense that I will just introduce the next 3 speakers and then you speak one after the other. Second suggestion is, I know you all have prepared statement, but if you want to present one bold idea on the table and then share your statement with the Secretariat, we will post it online. That obviously is also a possibility. So the next 3 speakers in that order. First we have Ryan Strove, Minister for Finance of Barbados. Secondly, His Excellency Dirchong Nyor, Minister of Finance of South Sudan. Thirdly, Neil Reichenberg, Minister of Finance, Eswatini. Barbados, please.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Just very quickly, we fully support the establishment of the Global Sovereign Roundtable because clearly the evolution of interest rates in the last few years, in the last year, has caused significant debt service considerations, and therefore we fully support the implementation of that in order to bring further relief to us as V20 members. We are currently working with the IMF and the MDBs in order to collaborate in terms of developing a climate finance strategy for Barbados. Now, the reason that this is important is because collaboration among stakeholders is going to be important if we're going to respond very clearly to the climate crisis. And as we have a single climate policy in Barbados, I would encourage all of us, under the context of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, that we're able to ramp that up and work with the stakeholders in order to drive that. I want to acknowledge Deputy Managing Director Boli for helping us to lead that charge, because it is critically important that we work together and do so quickly. Now, you asked about something very specific, and we have issued natural disaster clauses in our restructured debt. And I'm happy to see that some MDBs, as well as bilateral countries, have been issuing such instruments, clauses now. The reality is that whilst it gives a 2-year moratorium of relief in order to rebuild post an event, none of us in this room actually want to experience a devastating event in order to rebuild. So what we are asking for is for us to be able to work through the World Bank and the IMF to see whether or not we can proactively trigger natural disaster clauses of that type upfront, such that we can build and accelerate the implementation of climate mitigation and adaptation efforts in order to reduce the impact of these events as they intensify. And therefore, Barbados calls on all of us to see if we can work that through, because that will bring our citizens greater relief today rather than tomorrow. And lastly, the Bridgetown Initiative certainly contemplates a range of reforms, and I urge colleagues for your participation either in person or virtually with us in Bridgetown as we review these very progressive meetings this week in order to make sure that the second iteration is actually much more insightful. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much indeed. Applause, Minister, for being so specific as well. Let's go to, in that spirit, to South Sudan.
Thank you. I think today's dialogue marks a very important step in our efforts towards working for a more systemic change to address the climate change problems in our countries. This dialogue must therefore open more innovative sources of finance and financial architecture that better responds to the needs of our countries. For South Sudan, the impact of climate change is real. The extreme flooding that have hit our country during the past 3 years has completely resulted in food insecurity because it sharply disrupted the crop cycle. We did apply we did receive a disbursement from the IMF under the food shock window, which helped the situation in a way. But let me say, access to new and sustained sources of climate financing will play a crucial role in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement and implementing the NDC, mitigation and adaptation activities in South Sudan. It is estimated that South Sudan will require a total of $10 billion for the implementation of all the NDC intervention and strategies over the next 10 years. And we will have made an explicit call that our country be provided with opportunities to access technical and financial support. We look forward to have the climate prosperity plans because it will help unlock the resources for strategic interventions, taking both the climate change and social and economic development in our countries. Chair, the 4 priority areas of the Accra-Marrakesh agenda are critical for unlocking new resources to deal with the climate emergency. South Sudan fully supports this agenda and look forward to its finalization in Marrakesh later this year. Thank you.
Well, indeed, thank you so much, Honourable Minister. I think the agenda itself and the declaration will come at the next agenda item of this meeting, indeed. Let's turn to Eswatini, Honourable Minister.
Thank you so much, Moderator. Appreciate that. I'll also skip my script and just I felt it might be valuable to give a quick example of the week in the sense that we came here, myself and my team this week from Eswatini, small landlocked country in Southern Africa. We felt it was a great opportunity for us to see if we can unlock green energy. Our country currently imports about 80% of its energy, mainly from fossil fuel resource. And we have enough internal resources to be able to produce green energy, 100%, but the cost of energy is slightly higher than what we're buying from, hence we're looking for a possible debt for carbon, debt for climate change swap to be able to close that gap so that it doesn't impact the Maswati people directly, and we can actually move over 100% within 3.5 to 4 years, what it would take us. Even though it's been our agenda, we've had a few discussions during the week, but we're going to be leaving today without much traction going down this road. And so hence, and it might be our fault, might be not knowing exactly where to have the right discussion in the right place, but hence, just the call upon V20. And I think the three main elements that one ends up with in the document is to formalize the carbon market, for us to be able to really have a clear path to loss and damage, and an independent secretariat, I really believe will help us tremendously as member countries to be able to come, have very focused discussions, very focused agenda items, and come out with outcomes. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Honourable Minister, to be so direct indeed. Excellent. Let's go to the second cluster, so to say. I'm going to introduce the next three speakers, if you allow me. First, Honourable Minister Moussa Cissé, Minister of Finance, Guinea. Second, Honourable Minister Michel Bossuer, Minister of Finance of Haiti. And the third one is Honourable Permanent Secretary of Tanzania, Dr. Natu Wamba. So first, Guinea.
Merci, Monsieur le Modérateur. 2 points saillants.
Thank you, Moderator. 2 main points very quickly. Considering the shocks, it's important to enhance concessional financing and to work with rating agencies that overestimate risk in Africa. That will allow us to invest in growth-enhancing infrastructure and dams, among other projects. We are a mining country, and we are also the water tank of our region. If we don't get enough support, as I was telling the MD this morning, Guinea will not be able to continue to provide water to Guinea, Gambia, and Senegal, and that could lead to a drought in these countries. Now, I would like to commend the Minister of Finance of Ghana for his able leadership of the V20. I would like to welcome the report that has just been presented, and I support the final communiqué, and I call on donors to support the V20 proposals. This is an opportunity to transmit the gratitude of our president to the MD for the food shock window that has supported us tremendously. Thank you. As you know, Haiti is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. Disasters annually account for 2% of our GDP. We have been hit by successive crises that have limited our ability to face climate-related vulnerabilities, the impact of which is felt on infrastructure, agricultural productivity, and the economic stability of our country. When we consider the solutions required for climate change, adaptation requirements surpass the financial capacity of many countries. Facing this existential threat requires tremendous support for resilience. We also call on international partners such as the IMF and the World Bank to support SIDS, especially the most vulnerable, like Haiti, in disaster risk management and adapted growth policy to enhance climate resilience. We support initiatives to develop climate prosperity plans, I would like to join other V20 countries to request the full recognition of our group at the IMF and World Bank. Thank you.
Sir, let's move to Tanzania.
Thank you, Honorable Ministers. The global climate financing architecture is complex and involves multiple channels for funding. This includes, as heard before, multilateral, bilateral, public, private sources, domestic, and also international funds. Understanding these different channels is important for identifying opportunities and challenges for climate finance. Moreover, it is critical to improve the transparency, comparability, and accessibility of climate finance data, which is crucial for ensuring that investments are aligned with climate goals, avoiding misallocation of capital, and ensuring public accountability. Different types of financial instruments and mechanisms, such as green bonds, carbon pricing, and climate risks, can play a role in mobilizing climate finance and managing climate risks, but each comes with its own trade-off and challenges. Given adequate support to effectively adaptation strategies in the form of predictable finance, capacity building, and appropriate technologies, vulnerable countries can minimize the cost of future climate change to the impact of climate change. Moreover, efforts should be put to simplify the procedures set in accessing the climate finance and to increase climate finance to developing countries on adaptation through grants. Tanzania is currently in the process of getting an accreditation to access the green climate funds. So in conclusion, Tanzania acknowledged various efforts that V20 has been undertaking as a platform to help vulnerable countries in facing climate change dilemma and ways to assist in promoting and securing climate funding. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Madam. So on the list of speakers, so there's a list, there's a time, and there's a reality which not necessarily matches in one go. There is one final member state of the V20 I think is extremely important to give the floor to, is the Cabinet Secretary of Kenya, Professor Ndungu. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's my first time to be here, so I'm very happy that I've been given this privilege. Let me make 3 points. First, I think I heard about the 1.5 degrees global warming, and our recent analysis shows that countries in the Horn of Africa, for example, and Kenya in particular, are already to the right of the 1.5 degrees Celsius. What does that tell us? It tells us that the vulnerabilities in the future are going to continue and they are going to be more pervasive. One of the things even to analyze, the recent drought effect in the Horn of Africa has actually been the whole issue of food security, energy prices, and climate change. It has reversed perhaps 20 years of efforts of poverty reduction and inequality, and even introduced social conflict. So you can imagine the pervasiveness of that. The second point is about development finance. Most of these countries are facing huge, catastrophic availability of development finance. And that is why there is a lot of impetus in terms of how do we restructure the multilateral development institutions and even banks. And one of them is actually, the CREMA is actually, in this reform, is actually requesting for 3 things: flexibility, speed, and innovativeness in terms of coming up with finance. The last point is about how we can actually structure and develop local solutions. In Kenya, for example, development partners have actually developed an innovative financing locally led climate action. We call it FLOCA. And it's a program that most of the development partners are putting some funds to look for localized solutions. It should also be consistent with the global solutions that we are discussing here. And that, for me, is going to be very, very important. But finally, also, Kenya is going to have a climate finance summit in September, and heads of state are actually welcome. So it is another area where we are going to look for local solutions, as well as try to see how they are consistent with global solutions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much indeed, Honourable Minister. Also mentioning your climate summit in early September 4 to be precise. And we as GC are very humbled to support you in that effort together with the CVF, V20 and other partners indeed. I see the Moroccan Minister is back with us. Madam Minister, we would like to give you the floor. Minister Laila Benali, Minister of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development. The homework assignment is, what is your one big, bold idea to crack the climate finance crisis?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll just be very, very brief. Obviously, we need to develop climate prosperity plans to deliver really positive climate action in the framework of the development programs that we have discussed. Morocco being a destination for competitive renewable projects, we want to ensure the delivery of sustainable development goals for our people, for our economy, and also for our region being Africa, Europe, and the Atlantic Basin. So I really want to echo our support for the Accra-Marrakesh agenda to reform the international financial architecture to deliver something for the most vulnerable. But it's really vital to flag the issue of risks, of risk sharing, and of risk mitigation, and taking into account the various risks that are in that trajectory. So while it's really great to see financial engineering at work in organizations, we wanted also to mention that the World Bank and the IMF would be unequivocal with regard to the 1.5 degrees limits of the Paris Agreement. It really has to be non-negotiable. When it comes to risk sharing, I mean, we are quite happy to see additional thinking on macro level insurance, on contingent debt clauses, on strengthening social safety nets. That's very, very important indeed, and pre-arranged financing programs and financing arrangements. However, we really want to take into account the fact that on the mitigation and adaptation frameworks that we're having, we start to see, in addition to the loss and damage issues that some countries are facing and our group of countries is facing, we also noticed an issue regarding the development and the financing of renewable projects in the long-term nature of those projects. So there has to be a rethinking of insurance and the rethinking of the risk sharing of those renewable projects that are meant to tackle climate change. So, and we are looking forward, of course, for the V20 to have an independent voice on the table of global economic transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed, Honourable Minister. Let's now move to a very important supporter of the V20 agenda and the members since the beginning, quite frankly. Germany, of course, has been very instrumental in supporting this, the V20 institutionalization and the agenda, but certainly that also applies to the United States government. So we're delighted to have you with us here, Honourable Alexia Latarture, Assistant Secretary, U.S. Department of Treasury. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. My late father from a V20 country, Haiti, always used to say, à l'impossible nous sommes tenus. We are beholden to the impossible. And so I'm firmly committed to creating possibilities against all odds. More importantly, so Secretary Yellen and the whole Treasury Department. And so I want to share with you 4 areas in which we're trying to create possibilities. The first one has been touched upon. It is evolving the MDBs to be suitable to the 21st century challenges, climate being topmost among those. We started with the World Bank. I don't play baseball either. First base, we need a home run across vision and mission, incentive structures, operational models, and financing capacity. I will not lay out the whole agenda. I'll make 2 points here. The first one is we've asked the World Bank to really help figure out how to integrate vulnerability in the resource allocation decisions of the institution. That is critical work ahead. Secondly, many of you have spoken about concessionality. And so we need to think about how to raise concessional finance, but also how to spend it to the places where the highest impact is. So a framework, principles to think about how to use concessionality, absolutely for low-income countries, in targeted places for middle-income countries is another ask. Let me move to the second area for possibilities for us. It's looking at the climate finance architecture and trying to leverage it in a more strategic way to increase volume, to increase effectiveness, to make it easier for countries to access funding already available. So we'll be doing a review of that architecture to try to make it more effective. Thrilled to be co-chairing the Green Climate Fund. Welcome Afalde as the incoming head of the Green Climate Fund. There's a lot to do here. It's a replenishment year. We'll all have to sort of deliver for that. Also very pleased to be working with the State Department on the Transition Committee for the loss and damage arrangements, including the fund. So big work ahead this year. The third area is just to echo what's been said about debt vulnerabilities. It's a top priority to address this as an interrelated piece of addressing the climate crisis. And then the last piece I want to focus on is work we're doing to integrate climate and transition risks into our macroeconomic models. With that, I'll say the US government is both honored and humbled to be part of this really important table of spring meetings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexia, for your very strong statement, also on behalf, of course, of Secretary Yellen. Much appreciated indeed. So we're now at our sort of last cohort of 3 speakers to close out this part of the second roundtable. First, Ambroise Voyel, Vice President, EIB. Second, Marliou, from the Task Force on Climate Development and the IMF. And obviously, the last one, my very close friend, Manish Bapna, President and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council. But first, you, Ambroise, one big idea.
Thank you, Patrick. EIB is the bank of the European Union, so for the European Union, climate and development are key elements of our action. So they are key elements of the action of the European Investment Bank, and we are already actually doing 60% of our action in supporting climate action in the world. I would say one thing on instruments that I take from this meeting and on which we are working, and one thing on what I think is important also in innovation. We need to improve the instruments that we have, and here there are 2 things on which we are working. One is longer-term maturities, and the second one is what the Minister of Barbados has said, which is how to include natural disaster clauses upfront in our contracts. The thing that I also think is we need to increase and improve our innovation. Here there are 2 things we are working on currently. The first one is a global green bond initiative with the European Commission to support the extension of green bond markets in partner countries. The second one is, of course, the RST with the IMF, and in particular we're active in Rwanda and in Barbados. I would just like to say that I also completely share Alexia's point on risk and the need to link micro and macro risk on climate. As the EU Climate Bank, we know that bold action in climate is needed, and we stand ready to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed. Marilou.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity today to brief you on the Task Force preliminary assessment of the development orientation of IMF's climate strategy. Hard copies are available in this room and in a link in the communique. So the Task Force welcomes the important actions by the IMF to mainstream its climate change in its work, and has suggestions in 3 areas, but very briefly. First is to recognize that one policy, carbon pricing, does not fit all. Diverse countries use mostly non-pricing policies nationally for climate mitigation, and so mobilizing new sources for climate financing is critical. Second is to better capture the full implications of compounding climate-related risks and cross-border policy spillovers, so as not to underestimate the macro-fiscal implications of the climate transition. Debt sustainability analysis, for example, and it's been mentioned, should explicitly account for climate risks and their macro-fiscal implications. Third and lastly is to scale up the IMF's lending capacity in ways that align short-term and long-term financing horizons without jeopardizing debt sustainability and growth prospects. With these, the task force looks forward to new directions in the IMF's climate change approach and to continued engagement with the V20. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed. Which brings us to the last speaker of the roundtable to wrap this up, Manish.
Great. Thank you very much. Over the past 2.5 hours today, we've heard an incredible number of very compelling proposals, many of them contained in the Accra Marrakesh agenda, that are all about how we can unlock more climate and development financing, how we optimize, how we leverage, how we innovate for more capital. But the one point I want to make is I want to spotlight the real difference between this conversation happening today in the world of policy from the conversation that needs to happen in the world of politics, particularly in high-income countries. That the boldest reforms that we want to see take forward require politics, political support, political muscle in rich countries to unlock the reforms and the resources necessary to move this conversation forward. Here we sit at the IMF in Washington, D.C. 2 miles away is the U.S. Capitol. 8 months ago, a big climate bill was passed, as you know, in the United States, several $100 billion. And yet, very limited. No support in that bill for international climate finance, very little support in general for international climate finance. Although the European countries tend to be more generous, still not nearly at the scale that we need to see. That if we're serious about moving some of these reforms forward at a level that's commensurate with the challenge, we need to bridge this gap. This world of policy needs to meet the world of politics in high-income countries. We need to build greater political muscle. And as a representative from civil society, really to look at how we as civil society can work with the V20 to actually change the politics in the rich world to unlock the resources and reforms we need. Just want to close, and as today is a kind of a day of hope. My father often tells me that pessimists are right more often, but optimists win more often. And although it may seem like a daunting task, I feel quite inspired about what we can do together over the coming years. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Manish, for your closing statement, which also wraps up this roundtable. In a sense, also going back to you, Axel, with your metaphor of baseball, and well, is it baseball, is it football, is it something else? Which brings me to one thought out of this meeting. You and I have a fellow citizen in the Netherlands, Sifan Hassan, originally from Ethiopia. And let's go back to the Olympics 2020. She was the only person ever who won 2 gold medals, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, and a bronze medal for the 1500. And just before her first race, she was asked, what do you think? Are you going to win these 2 medals and the gold? She said, well, actually, it's hard, but hard is not impossible. And that's precisely, I think, also to your point on politics. It's going to be hard, but hard is not impossible. So Ken, please close this meeting with the adoption of this statement and guide us through to the Americas agenda indeed. Back to you, sir.
Thank you. We certainly cannot fail with Patrick and President Nasheed on our side of this great fight. Hard is not impossible. Yeah. And as the book says, it's not too late. So Patrick, once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to this energy and support that you have. A few things that we need to clear up before we go, and to really add to this sense and maybe reverence of this whole climate agenda. And Patrick, I'll take you back to the Bible, Genesis 2. And the Lord God placed man in the Garden of Eden to tend and to care for it. Let us do that and be optimistic about where we're going, that we will win. So this brings us to the last segment of today's Ministerial Dialogue here in Washington, D.C. We'll proceed on to adopting the Ministerial Dialogue communique. Members of the V20, are there any objections to the draft communique circulated by the Secretariat? hearing and seeing no objections, the communique is therefore duly adopted. Thank you. So let me especially thank fellow V20 members, the G7 and the G20 representative partners, principals of MDBs and IFIs for joining today's very, very important ministerial dialogue where we also, I guess, Bridgetown is symbolic. How do we bridge policy and the politics to get things done? We've energized the critical issue of advancing a fit-for-climate global financial architecture and must ensure we maintain the momentum until we see the transformation that climate-vulnerable countries require to attain sustainable and climate-resilient growth, but more importantly, for greater prosperity for the world. We do not have decades to respond. We only have 6 years and about 8 months to course correct. Let us make it happen. Let us listen to Nagita and therefore work with a sense of urgency. We look forward to working through the reform agenda in Paris and in Nairobi and to reconvene in Marrakesh in order to share our solutions in Dubai. And I'll bring this dialogue to a close. Thank you, and may God bless us.